Okay, well, great. Good morning. I'm speaking with Ambassador Rosenblum, and we're going to go over a really interesting and long career in Russia. And so, let me just start by asking you, how did you get interested in Russia at the very beginning in your as a young person?
Yeah, so I had an unusual childhood, I suppose, that got me interested very early on. My father, who was a scientist at NASA, he was a chemist, worked for 30 years at NASA developing rocket fuels and later solar photovoltaic panels for the satellites. He, in his spare time, I guess you could say, had a second life as a human rights activist. And he got very interested in the early 1960s in the plight of Soviet Jews. And he and some members of his synagogue formed a sort of a discussion group, which led them to do some reading. And they concluded that the community of Jews in the Soviet Union was under threat for both from anti-Semitism from the Soviet regime and also just sort of cultural extinction because they couldn't practice their religion. So they began to highlight this through education and advocacy, and eventually it evolved into a political movement, sort of where they were pressuring the U.S. government to um, adopt restrictions on the relationship with the Soviet Union because of Soviet's human rights record and specifically related to Jews. So in the end, and by the way, that in the end led to the adoption of so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment.
Right.
Vanik, by the way, was a congressman, Charlie Vanik from Cleveland, which is was my father's congressman. It was our district. It was not a
Ah, okay.
coincidence that Vanik was the co-sponsor of that bill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And
but
was this an organization? Did you it have form into an
it
organization?
did. Yeah. Well, it's originally it was the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. But then they kind of joined forces with other similar organizations that were emerging in cities around the United States and Canada, and they formed in 1970 something called the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. And my father, Lou Rosenblum, was the first chairman of the Union of Councils,
Oh,
Soviet Jews, and it was. It became a national and international movement. They joined up with people in Great Britain and France and Israel itself. Anyway, long story short, my dad was completely immersed in this activity for a period of probably about 15 to 20 years. And so it sort of took over our home to some extent. His office was in the basement of our house. And I still remember when I was little, my best friend and I used to play in the basement and play imaginary games. And we had this competition to see what would it take to get my dad's attention. Like what outrageous things could we do that he would actually notice? We would like have pillow fights and throw things around. And the reason that was a game was that my dad was so focused on his work. He had this ability to just laser focus and so he didn't even notice what we were up to. But
oh,
anyway,
wow.
this wasn't for me just abstract in the sense that my dad's working on this stuff and I don't really understand what he's doing. It was very real. I mean, he brought me to protest demonstrations. We had like if there was a Soviet cultural uh, group, dancers or musicians visiting Cleveland, which they sometimes did on tours. We would, there'd be a protest with signs.
Uh-huh.
We had projects to send things into Jews in the Soviet Union because eventually this led to building contacts. And, there was actually there were phone calls, there were letters being sent. Obviously, some of it was blocked by the Soviet censors and or just didn't get to the recipients. But over time, they were sending packets like for Passover every year. There would be like a gift, a care package being sent to specific Jewish families in the Soviet Union. So there were these phone calls, and I would sometimes listen in and hear the Russian being spoken. There'd be an interpreter there. And then some of the Jews got out eventually who wanted to emigrate because they couldn't practice their religion freely in the Soviet Union. And These are the so-called refuseniks. I'm sure that that term's probably familiar to a lot of people of our generation.
Sure.
People who had been refused permission to emigrate, but eventually did get out. And some of these refuseniks actually came to our house in Cleveland and would kind of visit with my father, debrief with him, and also he would take them on speaking tours around the United States to synagogues and community centers and places around. Again, part of this educational process, and so it was part of my childhood, part of my
Uh-huh.
growing up, and I was intrigued, of course, as one would be by all of this, and wondered I wanted to know more, wondered like what's really going on, what's it really like in the Soviet Union, and then the Cold War and everything around relations between the United States and the Soviet Union was fascinating to me. So
Hmm.
that's how I kind of got started. And
Okay.
when I went to college, I decided to study Russian history, Russian language, Russian literature, so I would understand the place better.
Right.
And I
Where
remember
did you go to college?
I went to Yale University,
Okay.
and so I started freshman year with my Russian studies. And it was, I remember,
And in that what year?
this was 1980.
1980. Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
entered in 1980. And I still remember, the Russian department at Yale was in the basement of a building. It was called the Hall of Graduate Studies. I think the building's still there. I know it's still there. The basement's probably nicer now than it was then. It's been fixed up, but it was kind of this sort of dank, shabby set of rooms, and that's where we were drilled on Russian grammar. And there was this old couple who I think were emigres from Soviet Union from a much earlier era. I don't know when, maybe the 40s or 50s. The Khramovs, and Amelia and Konstantin Khromov, and they were sticklers for Russian grammar. It had to be, you had to really learn the grammar. And so my grammar knowledge is still pretty good, even as my proficiency as I get older and don't practice it as much has gone down. I still have really good Russian grammar because of the Khromov. So that's the
They
legacy of,
taught you
yeah.
well. They taught you
Yes,
well.
yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was in the end a history major, not specifically a Russian studies major, but and it's ironically my father sort of talked me out of being a Russian and East European studies major, which is what I first wanted to do, because his logic was that if I got too specialized, too young, and then sort of followed a track where I could only, study one thing or one subject, that it could lead to a limitation later in life, especially, and this is kind of revealing of the mentality at the time. He said, well, let's say you need to do research and you go to Russia, go to the Soviet Union to do research, and you get in trouble with the KGB, or something. And because well, I'll get to this in a second, but why he was thinking that. But and then you'll be barred from ever going back, and then you can't do your
Right.
job. So anyway, I bought into it, and I figured I'm just an undergraduate, so I stayed broader. But I took a lot of courses on Russian literature, Russian history, Soviet history, etc. By the way, the one thing I didn't mention, this fear about the KGB, that I didn't mention about my father's experience, and my family's experience, that was again formative for me as growing up, was that my both my father and later one of my sisters, who became active in the Soviet Jewry movement, visited went to the country as tourists. Technically with an
Right.
in-tourist package, but in fact they were there to visit refuseniks and to
Uh-huh.
bring things, like Jewish ritual items, books, Hebrew books, and so on, and to kind of build this tie, this bond with the Soviet Jews. And my dad went, I think, in 1973 with a small group, and
Yeah.
they made like little films and videos that they were able to bring out, which wasn't such an easy thing. And then my sister and her then boyfriend, now husband, still many years later, visited in 1974, and they got picked up by the KGB. I think I want to say it might have been in Kiev because they did a multi-city tour,
Sure. Yeah.
and they were held for like 24 hours and questioned. They had been well briefed and well prepared for the trip, so they basically said, we'll only tell you what you're asking about if we have somebody from the United States Embassy present.
Uh-huh.
And they kept insisting on that. They weren't, my sister was just, got some rough questions. I think my brother-in-law was roughed up a little bit, not
Uh-huh.
serious torture, but just kind of, he was not treated very well. Anyway,
Right.
they got out, but of course, the story of their detention was
Right.
a big deal in the family. I think there were actually at the time the Los Angeles Times had a correspondent in Moscow who covered the story and wrote articles for the LA Times about it. So again, this was like formative for
Yes.
me,
Right.
this
Right.
image of the Soviet Union. Um, and uh, and I guess maybe I'll conclude this part of the
Yeah.
answer because I am going on a bit, but I will by talking about sort of my first experience visiting
Sure. Yeah.
Soviet Union and visiting Russia. After all of this, okay, so I finished undergrad at Yale. I didn't go right to grad school. I went to Washington because I was always really interested in government and politics. And I had done an internship one of the semesters in college in Washington, worked for my senator, my congresswoman for 6 months. And so I went back there after graduating, and I got a job on Capitol Hill working for a senator from Michigan named Carl Levin, who
Uh-huh.
passed away a few years ago. Great man, I think, great public servant, senator for 36 years. And Levin, in Levin's office, I did do some work with human rights issues, including Soviet Jewry issues, as well as, and this is like from 85 to 89. So we're talking
Okay.
late 1980s,
Right.
Gorbachev period, a lot of things changing, a lot of interesting ideas in the air, which I was following as closely as I could. And I still remember there were in the late 80s, there were sometimes people coming from the then Soviet government to Washington, and there were think tanks that were holding events where they were starting to talk about experimentation with the economic reforms and
Right.
the cooperatives and other things that started to emerge in the 80s under Gorbachev. And there was a lot of skepticism among some in Washington about how real this was. It's just window dressing. Is it real? But and again, I was very much sort of drawn into all of that. So I spent. Oh, and one other thing I should mention about Levin and that time that sort of drew me in a certain direction. He had a lot of constituents from Eastern Europe in Michigan. From a lot of Hungarians, a lot of uh, Poles, a lot of Romanians, and so on. And at one point, I got pretty involved in some efforts by the Polish community to try to support Solidarność in Poland.
Uh-huh.
And I had taken some seminars at Yale about Eastern Europe, and I remember reading the story of Solidarność and what had happened in Poland in the early 80s. And I have to say again, it was inspiring to me. Like I really felt like this is something worth supporting in some
Uh-huh.
way,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and maybe something like this can happen someday in the Soviet Union. That thought did occur to me,
Right. Right.
and so by the time I left Levin's office, I had decided the reason I left after about 4 years was I thought, okay, this has been a great experience. I've learned a lot about Washington, how government works, how politics works. It was frankly like the best possible education you could have if you want to understand Washington to work on
Right.
Capitol Hill. I still believe that, but everything, my knowledge I felt of everything was kind of superficial. It was very skin deep. I covered a half dozen different issues for Levin. Not just I did some
Right.
foreign policy, but a lot of it was domestic stuff, transportation issues, veterans issues, etc. And I I wanted to go deep on something. I wanted to really
Uh-huh.
understand something better. So I went to grad school. starting in 1989 to Johns Hopkins, SAIS,
Right.
School of Advanced International Studies, and got went and pursued my master's in Soviet studies, which was still a
Uh-huh.
thing. It was still a
Right.
thing called Soviet studies then.
Right.
And by the way, the SAIS requirement, and I don't know if this is still true, but it was when I was there, is that you had a list of a choice of your concentration that was long. There were a lot of choices. I chose Soviet studies, but everyone also had to have a concentration in international economics. That was a requirement. So I did take a lot of economics courses, and I ended up writing my master's thesis about the cooperative movement in the Soviet Union, which was just emerging, this sort of nascent private sector activity,
Right.
which was, they were trying to call it something different, differentiated from the evil West, which I mean that some of that rhetoric was starting to dissipate, I'd say, by the
Right.
late 80s,
Right.
but there was still this idea that we're not going to go become capitalists. We're going to do something that's sort of in between, that's more socially minded or something, and that was this cooperative movement. So I actually used it was you were required to use primary source material. So I was getting stuff from Russian newspapers of the day, Komsomolskaya Pravda and Izvestia and a whole bunch of other newspapers, which the Johns Hopkins Library had copies
Right.
of. So I was able to use those and to read what was being said and written about this cooperative movement. I probably have the paper somewhere. I haven't read it in a long time, but I think
Right.
my conclusion, as I recall, was that this was something this was something real. It seemed
Yeah.
something real, even though they were cloaking it in this rhetoric of not capitalism. In fact,
Right.
it was proto-capitalism that was happening on the ground.
Right.
So that was kind of my exposure.
And these cooperatives were purely Russian. Weren't the early joint ventures between Americans and Russians. These were Russian cooperative organizations that were quasi-private, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
These
Okay.
it wasn't, yeah, they weren't. Now there might have been some cases, although I don't remember writing about this at the time, where there were foreign investors involved in the cooperatives, even at that time. But I suspect,
Uh,
but the stuff I was reading about were purely Russian entities.
right. 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 I'm only asking to clarify that because we do have in the archive several of the Soviet era joint ventures. So there were several, and Trend Mos, the restaurant, was one, and Dialogue, which was a sort of a multifaceted collaboration, was another. So it was just differentiating them from what you're describing. Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. And
No,
then
not at all.
so you finished as part of that experience. You went to the Soviet Union then while you were doing this
Yes,
graduate
that's
work?
right. Yeah, that's where I was leading. Thank you for
Yes.
taking me
Yeah.
back to the
Yeah.
road that I was on
Right.
there. Yes, exactly. So during my time at Johns Hopkins, the summer after my first semester, because I started in January of 1989, so this is 89 we're talking about.
Right.
I spent a summer, 3 months or so in Moscow. I signed up for a program of an organization that was at the time called American Council of Teachers of Russian, ACTA,
Ah, right.
who sponsored these, language study programs. And they placed me at a place in Moscow called the Plekhanov Institute, which was an economics institute. Uh,
Right.
Although, again, the economics they were teaching and studying was a kind of hybrid of market economics and Marxism Leninism. It was they
Yeah.
still felt like they had to retain this, um, you know, ideological purity or something, so that they had to make reference to Marxism Leninism, but they were grappling with you know that model's not working. Clearly,
Uh-huh.
we need something new, and of course Gorbachev was officially sanctioning this new approach and this experimentation. So they were teaching that, I was really not there though to study economics. I was there to study Russian language because the purpose of the program was to kind of get my language high enough where I could pass the
And
P
I want to interrupt you just for a minute. So you were describing learning language at the Plekhanov
at the Plekhanov
Institute.
Institute. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that was uh, so yeah. I was my the focus was on Russian language, and so we were with the Fakultet Русского языка, the Russian language faculty there.
right.
I lived in the dormitories. They had foreign students who were studying there and living in the same dormitories that the other students did, although they did have a floor that had been specially, we were told, specially renovated for the
Uh-huh.
Americans so that
Uh-huh.
our conditions would be slightly better. And it did look kind of new, like the the beds and the you know, walls and doors seemed like they were fairly new. I will say that the plumbing was not new because I distinctly remember that, it was breaking down all the time. And also there was long stretches where we didn't have any hot water. In those days, there used to be like they they would be having they said they were having, special maintenance or cleaning going on, and there would, they'd cut off hot water for stretches at a time. And I don't think it was just the dormitory building. I think it was parts of the city because it was
Yeah,
all centrally supplied. Hot water was centrally
right,
supplied.
right,
Now,
right.
so anyway, so the dorm that was the dormitory, but and we ate a lot of our meals at the university, which was pretty pathetic. Now, this time in 1989, economically was a really bad time for Moscow and the whole Soviet Union. There were shortages of everything. The economy was tanking, and that was reflected in our life there and what we saw in the city. I remember, you'd go into a store, the typical state-owned grocery store, and there'd be almost nothing on the shelves. And what there was, there'd be lines for the few things that were there, and you
Right.
had to develop strategies. I mean, one of the strategies people at the time practiced, which we as students learned, is that when you're walking around the city, you always carry a bag with you, like a shopping bag, just
Yeah.
in case you find something that
Yes.
is, in deficit, as they would say,
Yeah. Right.
scarce
Right.
supply, and so you could be there, and be ready to carry it home.
Right. So were you primarily amongst Americans learning Russian, or did you have by that time the opportunity to get to know Russians, more informally?
Yeah, that great question, because in fact, yes, I did have a chance to meet Russians informally, and that became, I would say, the highlight and the most important part of my time there. In fact, by the end of my 3 months or so, I was skipping class a lot. It was apparently not that hard they didn't notice if you just didn't show up because my friends who I'd made Russian friends, young people in their 20s mostly who were, who I'd met one way or another, and they were always inviting me to join them for a picnic or go to somebody's house and, hang out. What was interesting to me was that and I'll just say that I learned a lot more Russian from those experiences than I did in the classroom.
Yeah.
It was the
Yeah.
time I spent just hanging out with people and talking that helped me by the end of that summer to get to a point where I wouldn't say necessarily, I certainly wasn't fluent in the native sense, but it was pretty good. I was having dreams in Russian by the end of that summer.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
often tell people that that summer of '89 was the peak of my Russian ability, in fact, because in years that followed, even though I at times used Russian professionally, I was never again in an immersion experience like that. I
Uh-huh.
was
Uh-huh.
living and speaking it every single day. And I really think, and maybe, I guess it depends on people are different in their language
Right.
acquisition
Right.
ability. But for me, I need that immersion to really be able to think in the language. I
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
now, my Russian is, I would say, atrophied to some extent over the years, but I haven't reached that point or returned to that point where you're thinking and dreaming in the language. Now I sort of have to translate in my head. But anyway,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
summer, the time I spent with friends, in addition to improving my Russian, it also gave me some insights into what the society was like and what people were thinking. So, for example, I was puzzled at first why my Russian friends always seemed to be free to just have picnics and hang out. And
Uh-huh.
they would always tell me. And by the way, a lot of the people I knew were had a scientific background, and they worked in like a laboratory or a research facility. So these were kind of like very, educated folks who were part of the professional class. And at that time, I think in the Soviet system, a lot of people were channeled into the sciences and into that kind of
Absolutely, yes.
work, whether they had were wanted to or not. But they were always telling me, "Сегодня санитарный день." So, it's a day like they're cleaning up the lab. They're gonna, but it was a joke because it was clearly just they were either playing hooky and just not
Yeah.
going to work, or it was closed because I don't know, there was no money or there was no work to do. So anyway, so a lot of free time and a lot of time to just muse about everything, and of course the sort of, I don't know, the philosophical nature of the Russian people came out in a lot of those conversations as they
Sure.
were talking about, how the world was changing and the different models, and is will your stuff that you do, your capitalism, actually work in with the Russian people and so on. So that was part of the atmosphere. And the other thing that was notable about that summer in my interactions was how incredibly popular Americans were there. I mean,
Um,
you could, you walk down the street and you were identifiable as, by the way you were dressed and just the way you looked and carried yourself.
yeah.
And
Often by your shoes. Yes.
right, yes, exactly. Shoes was a key indicator,
Yes.
right, of somebody from the West. And I was constantly being stopped by people, sometimes just wanting to say hello or practice their English, and sometimes wanting to sell me things
Uh-huh.
or buy things from me, assuming
Right.
that I was there to like sell jeans or something like that. And but and okay, usually these were just fleeting, encounters, but sometimes they led to longer conversations and even like a follow up or something. So it was that kind of atmosphere. People were curious, they were intrigued, and they were also, and it was a positive thing. It wasn't negative. There was one exception to that, which I guess maybe sort of revealed to me maybe the you might say the uglier side of the Russian spirit, the atmosphere at the time. And that was so they took us, the students in this ACTR program who were living together in the dorm. And by the way, you asked earlier about spending time. I did spend a little bit of time with my fellow American students, but I remember I knew at the time like what I'm going to get out of this is from encounters with Russians. So I really did focus on
Right.
that.
Right.
But we would go out and do stuff together. And at one point, the program actually organized a field trip to Leningrad, as it was still called then.
Right.
And we took the train up to Leningrad and we stayed in a dormitory at a university there that was terrible. It was like that was more the real conditions of the dormitory compared to the renovated one we had at Plekhanov. And and we had a couple days to tour and just kind of explore St. Peter, Leningrad. And I loved the city actually. Just the architecture and the museums and everything were amazing. But anyway, I remember one of the days we were there, we went to see what is now called Kazansky Sabor, uh,
Right.
on Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, which
Right.
was this cathedral, but at the time it was still the Museum of Atheism, because
I remember it. Yes, I've been there. Yes.
yes, it had been repurposed for that during the Soviet period in the 30s, I think. And and so we visited the museum, and it was like, it was kind of a curiosity to see, well, what are they going to say about religion in this museum? So we see the museum, and then afterwards, there was a small group of us, and we kind of split up. We went different ways, and I was by myself, and I was hanging out in a small park really close, just off Nevsky Prospect, and just people watching and seeing what was going on. And it was towards evening, and there was a group of young people, probably in their 20s or something, who were drunk. And I could tell from watching them a little bit that they were drunk. And they noticed me. they noticed me, and they one of them or a couple of them came up to me and they started talking to me in Russian, and I could tell I knew what they were saying, but I decided to play dumb because they were being very aggressive and very hostile, and what they were saying was, "Who are you? Where are you from? What nationality are you?" They kept saying, "What nationality are you?" Now I don't know if it was because they wanted to identify me as an American and they hated Americans. Maybe it was because they thought I was Jewish, which is also
Yeah.
possible, and they were targeting that. But they were, aggressively asking me these questions. I decided, I don't know why, but I decided my best strategy was to pretend I don't understand, right?
Right.
Doing
Right.
that. And eventually one of them actually pushed me down, and I fell down, and I think what happened was, I mean, he pushed me really hard, in the chest, and I fell down, fell backwards. And I I think that maybe they got a little scared that they had gone too far because they sort of ran away. And then a bunch of other people came up and somebody helped me up, and people were being very kind and considerate and sort of embarrassed by that behavior. So anyway, so it ended well, I suppose. But it
Yeah.
was scary in the moment. It was very scary.
Right.
There was this
Right.
real hostility that was, and of course, the drinking was clearly part of it.
Right.
So that was my one not so pleasant incident, but it also, I think, revealed a little bit about what was happening in, kind of in Russian society
Sure. Sure.
and some of these
Sure.
attitudes.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so anyway,
So,
so
yeah.
that was my first time in the country. And by the way, I should just to kind of end that story. At the end of the program, uh, I um, I had made plans to meet my then girlfriend slash partner, now wife of 34 years, Sharon, who was back in Washington, to meet her in Eastern Europe. So she flew. I took the train all the way from Moscow to Prague through via Poland, which was quite an experience in and of itself. And then met her in Prague, and we ended up traveling all over Czechoslovakia and Hungary for about 2 weeks by train, and just kind of slowly going around and stopping and seeing things and seeing places. And what was interesting was, and so this is summer of 1989, pre-Berlin Wall falling,
Right.
but there was change was in the air, as they say, and you could feel it both in terms of like the conversations we had with people who were in our compartment on the trains.
Yeah.
Was interesting to like we were sort of probing what do people think about their governments and
Right.
what's happening in the world. And then we even had, because we both had worked on Capitol Hill. Actually, my wife was still working on Capitol Hill at the time. She worked for a senator from New Jersey named Frank Lautenberg at the time, and so we had some contacts, and we had set up a few meetings. And I remember meeting with some guy who was like an opposition activist in Hungary, in Budapest, who later became, I think, the foreign minister of Hungary. And he, again, sort of asking him, like, well, what's really happening here?
Yeah.
And it was clear that things were changing, although,
Right.
of course, no one had any idea how far it was going to go or how fast it was going to go. It's
Right.
completely, it's not like I'm saying I predicted what was going to happen, but there was,
Right. But you could tell there was cracks and changes and things go under the surface that were happening, which meant some change.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand.
And I remember, I have a photo of this somewhere, which it's be kind of an interesting archival photo of um, uh, graffiti in Prague on the wall of a building, and it just said Havel.
Uh-huh.
That's what it's
Yeah.
Havel. It was just written
Yeah.
on the wall. And at that time, Havel was still, a dissident and not accepted by the government. In fact,
Right.
had been in
Right.
prison. So again, sort of change was in the air.
Right. Right.
So that was, yeah, so that was and then I went back to school for 3 more semesters, got my master's in the end of 1990, and well, anyway, I can go on about sort of what led me to my first job and kind of the postgraduate thing. But did you want to intercede at all with?
No, 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 not at all. I would like to move to that. I'd like to move to your job because you began, I believe that first job was you began a career working in the midst of all this change.
Yeah.
So that's let's go there. Let's do that. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, so as I neared my graduation from SAIS, it was clear to me that I wanted to be part of the change that was happening. And by then, of course, by the end of 1990, seismic things had occurred, right? You know, the
Right.
fall of the Berlin Wall, these different revolutions in Eastern Europe, including the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which was very inspiring to me. And Havel himself was an inspiring figure,
Uh-huh.
reading what he was writing. And what was interesting was that during my 2 years at SAIS, I felt like what was the events of the region had a great leveling effect between the students and the faculty, because the faculty who had been writing about the Soviet Union for, in some cases, decades, all of their assumptions were being blown up, right? That nobody
Yeah.
anticipated change happening the way it did or at the speed that it did. And so they were learning as we were learning, right?
Uh-huh.
We were learning together trying to understand what was happening. So it was a really good time to be going to grad school. I don't know how you could recreate those conditions
Right.
today
Right.
somewhere else. But anyway, I I was I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be involved in the region. That I wanted to be spending time back in Russia, and back in that area. And so my first idea was I could join the Foreign Service,
Uh-huh.
and I actually took the Foreign Service exam. So this would have been like early 1991, and I passed it. I passed the written and the oral, and they offered me a spot in a class, to enter. But I turned it down, and the reason I turned it down was that first of all, I wasn't sure that I wanted the lifestyle of a foreign service officer where you move every 2 or 3 years to a different country and you're rotating around embassies and you don't necessarily get to choose where you go, especially
Right.
in your
Right.
early career. And I wanted to be in the Soviet Union or in Russia. That's where I didn't want to go to Madagascar or something like that, even though I would have had to. So that was one factor. I think also my wife played a role because she was had a career. She was working on Capitol Hill. She was happy with her job, and she wasn't necessarily into this lifestyle of, moving around the world. And then the other thing was a better opportunity came along, at least as I saw it then.
Right.
That was a job offer from something called the Free Trade Union Institute, which is affiliated. It doesn't exist in its same form anymore. It's sort of become part of a bigger organization years later. But at the time, it was a 501(c)(3) organization that was very closely affiliated with the AFL-CIO.
Okay.
It was part of the structure of the international department of the AFL-CIO. The reason it had this separate existence as a 501(c)(3) is that allowed it to receive funding from outside donors, including and especially the U.S. government.
Uh-huh.
So, and the structure then was the AFL-CIO had several of these institutes that were regional. So the Free Trade Union Institute worked in Eastern Europe,
Hmm.
and they hoped to work in the Soviet Union, although when I joined them, they were just starting that. They hadn't managed to break in yet.
Right. But I assume they had worked with Solidarity
They
and
had, exactly, and
yeah.
that was kind of their bread and butter for years
Right.
before that. And in the 80s, they were supporting Solidarity when it was an outlawed underground organization in Poland.
Right.
And,
Right.
and frankly, that was one of the keys to Solidarity's survival and eventual success in the late 80s and then, the emergence of Lech Wałęsa and him becoming president. It really had a lot to do with that support that they were
Right.
getting from the American labor movement. And the and then they also had institutes for like Latin America and Africa and East Asia. But I was being recruited by the institute that did Eastern Europe.
Right.
Called it FTUI for short, FTUI, So I'll refer to it that way going forward.
Okay.
It's easier to say. So Fatui wanted me because I had the background of Russian language, of a knowledge of the country, some knowledge anyway, having been there and having studied it, and they were looking for someone to start basically a new program that they were conceiving to support emerging independent labor unions in Russia.
Okay.
Actually, in the whole Soviet Union, but Russia was a major focal point of that.
Right.
And it was still this was early 1991, so it was still the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I was excited by the opportunity. I thought, first of all, it will allow me to keep living in Washington, but to spend a lot of time in the region, because that was the way it was cast to me. Like, you will be the Washington program officer for these programs, but you'll be out in the region a lot. You'll be traveling in the region. So I liked that. And I also, frankly, there was a sort of excitement about what was happening at the time, and especially in the labor movement. And again, like, historically, a lot of people may remember this who know the early history of the emergence of independent Russia and so on. The worker strikes were becoming a big deal. And in 1989, 1990, and 91, there were a series of coal miner strikes in particular. The coal miners were going on strike on a regular basis. And the AFL-CIO was excited by it because they thought, okay, this is the emergence of a real workers' movement that's not subordinate to the communist system or the state, which is representing the real aspirations, they said, of working people. And those are the kinds of organizations that we want to support and make common cause with.
So what does support mean in that context?
Yeah.
What were they thinking? What was the purpose of the activities? What activities would this engage in, this of
Yeah.
support?
So that gets to my job and what I was
Right.
doing exactly, because my task was to get the funding to allow us to do programs in the Soviet Union, and the programs would be, and by the way, the source of funding was pretty clear. So National Endowment for Democracy,
Yeah.
NED, had been supporting the AFL-CIO for about, and particularly the institutes, directly this institute, Fatui, for probably 6 or 7 years already at that point. The NED was created under the Reagan administration in the early 80s to support democratic development around the world. And there were four core institutes, so-called, of the NED. One was the National Democratic Institute, sort of an arm of the Democratic Party; International Republican Institute, arm of the Republican Party; Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, which is an arm of the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so business; and then labor, AFL-CIO institutes,
Ah,
including Fatui.
okay.
So those were, and there was actually a core funding every year from NED, like a sort of basic budget that each of these institutes would get, each of the four. And then you could then compete for additional grants for specific programs. So part of my early work there was writing grant proposals. I wrote proposals explaining what we were going to do with the funding we got from NED. I'll just add here that later, not so much later, like in 92, 93, and beyond, we started getting a lot of grants from USAID, because that was
Okay.
when AID was launching its big programs in Russia, that were doing a whole host of different things. But one of them was support for civil society, democratic development. And under that rubric, we were getting grants from AID. But early on, it was National Endowment for Democracy. And what were we doing? What we were going to do with the money? That was your question.
Yes. Right.
So the idea was, first of all, to build relationships with these independent labor unions. So, like, part of it was just relationship building initially,
Yeah.
but the objective was to support these emerging organizations, which were an alternative to the official trade unions that were a legacy of the communist system that had existed throughout the Soviet period. Um, and the idea, again, going back to what I said earlier, is that these new organizations would be genuinely representative of workers and genuinely democratic organizations, whereas the old unions were part of the apparatus, the state apparatus of control,
Right.
essentially.
Right.
And by the way, I'll just, as an aside, say that when I would go later, when I went and visited factories and workplaces around Russia, there was often the old posters and like slogans were still up on the walls. And one of the slogans that I remember very clearly was the trade unions or Profsayuzi are a transmission belt of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So they were literally supposed to play this role of transmitting the ideology and the orders of the Communist Party to the workers. And
Yeah.
that's not what the AFL-CIO thought unions should do, right? It was
Right.
the
Right.
opposite of what they
Right.
should do.
Right.
So,
Okay.
okay, so provide them. So this money would be used to build a relationship, to provide them with training, seminars and training experiences, even exchange programs where they would come to the United States, to give them the knowledge they would need to survive and thrive as representatives of workers. And that's things like, how do you recruit members? Organizing, labor organizing, which is something the AFL-CIO unions have a lot of experience with. Not always very successful in our country, especially because
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
laws are very much against them to make it easy to, organize a union. But organizing, recruiting, um, collective bargaining with employers. How do you engage in a bargaining on behalf of your workers? Health and safety. There was a
Mm.
lot of emphasis on like what is worker health and safety? How do you build a safety culture in the
Mm.
workplace? Which was a huge issue for the coal miners, by the way, as you would
Yeah.
imagine. Um, and because the coal mine accidents were frequent and terrible in the Soviet mines at that time. And then part of it was about just bringing these nascent independent trade unions into the larger world of the international labor movement. So
Mhm.
giving them
Mhm.
contact and ties with unions around the world so that they could learn from them and build a sense of solidarity.
Right. So at this point, you're beginning the program, you're getting money, you understand some of the programmatic activities you want to engage in. Did you actually have contact with these Soviet organizations, and how did that happen? Did they reach out to you? Did you reach out to them? And how did you do that? How did you build those relationships?
Yeah, great question. It's not a simple answer, but so it started, I think, because there were two sort of streams that led to the building the contacts. One was that we had some really smart and um, well-connected advisors and consultants working for us. And interestingly, these were people from the human rights movement in what had been the Soviet Union. The key person was a woman named Ludmila Alexeyeva, who in human rights circles is sort of legendary. She died about 6 years ago or something, but she had been one of the founders back in the 1970s of something called the Moscow Helsinki Group,
Hmm.
and which is a group of what we then called dissidents, and who were writing and advocating on behalf of sort of basic human rights, and at a time when that would get you thrown in prison or in exile very quickly. And in fact, after several years of this activity of hers, she was exiled. She was basically forced to leave the country. I want to say in the late 70s. And she ended up living in Burke, Virginia, not too far from Washington, D.C., for probably 20 or 25 years. During that, but she maintained a lot of her contacts in the Soviet Union. And during the latter part of that, so we're talking about getting into the late 80s and 90s, she became a consultant for the AFL-CIO. Um,
Uh-huh.
the AFL-CIO, just taking a step back, had always been first virulently anti-communist.
Uh-huh.
Second, very focused on not just worker rights, but more broadly, human rights, and had
Uh-huh.
made common cause. They were one of the first to speak out in behalf of Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and all these people, and they were very clued into that. And it's interesting. I went into this job not knowing much about labor at all, either labor history or union organizing or anything. I wasn't hired because of my knowledge of labor. I was hired because of my knowledge of the country and the region, and that's what they wanted me to do. I
Right.
learned some things, and one of the things I learned was that the labor movement in the 40s and 50s, there was this effort by the Communist Party of the USA and also other communist groups to sort of infiltrate and take over American labor movement. And there was this big struggle, internal struggle, and the AFL-CIO emerged out of that struggle as taking a position of we will not allow communism to take us over. We're anti-communist. And then that became part of the international policy of the AFL-CIO. So just to give a very concrete example of how this manifests, in the 1960s, the AFL-CIO and its president, George Meany, at the time, were very supportive of the Vietnam War at a time when many of their members, and of course the broader society, was turning against the war and
Right.
protesting. The organized labor was staunchly pro, Vietnam War because it was about containment of communism, et cetera. So,
Right.
and because of this position, the Soviet regime viewed the AFL-CIO as very much the enemy. They used to, in Soviet propaganda, they were portrayed as the AFL-CIA.
Uh-huh.
That was the name that was always used. They were, they're just they're an arm of the intelligence of the United States, and they're all spies and blah blah blah. And by the way, that later came back to hit me in various ways when I went there, because whenever I would tell people, especially older people who I met in Russia, that I was representing the AFL-CIO, they say, "Oh, you must be a spy, right?
You must be a spy, right?
You know,
Spion, right?
yeah." So
Yeah.
anyway, so uh,
You're the consultants,
the
and
consultant. So Ludmila Alexeyeva was a key person. She knew and had contact with people who were in touch with the coal miners, especially. And then she, in turn, connected us with people living in Moscow, especially in Moscow, but in other places too, who were plugged into that network. And what was important was that the coal miners also, and it really all started from the coal miners' unions. That was the entry point, I would say. The coal miners were very politically sophisticated, I would say.
uh-huh,
And early on, their demands when they went on strike were not just economic, they were also political. They wanted, not only did they want better wages, better working conditions, safety, all those things for their members, but they wanted a change in the management of the coal industry, which would start by getting rid of the control by the all union entities, because of course they were all state owned. They were state owned
right,
enterprises. Get rid of that and move control to the republic level. And this
uh-huh,
is this is even before the breakup of the Soviet Union. They were saying
right,
the Ukraine Republic and the Russia Republic, whatever, they're the ones who should have the level and the control. And essentially, what this ended up doing was making them allies of Boris Yeltsin.
uh-huh,
So they were, and Yeltsin was encouraging the activity of the strikers, and Gorbachev was fighting against it. So in this power struggle that was going on at the time between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, the miners were on Yeltsin's side.
uh-huh,
And it was a key element of Yeltsin's support, which I think may have had a lot to do with him eventually emerging as the leader of Russia and
right.
and so on. Um, so that was how we started, was with the
Okay, so let me just pause that for a second
yeah.
because there's a parallel that it just struck me while you were speaking is that in the area of business, many of the early businesses arose out of contacts that came from the citizen diplomacy movement, that there were Americans and Russians in contact over the fear of nuclear war, primarily in the 80s, which built relationships and then led to some of the very early business and reform and business organizations from those contacts. So that the context that existed between Americans and Russians in the 80s have are important for how the 90s developed. And you're describing how that happened within the human rights community, that human rights community, in a sense, morphed into something else or
Mhm.
helped to explain how it merged your contacts with the labor movement and your efforts to form these unions, right? And,
I think that's a very good analogy. Yes, I agree. I mean,
okay.
although interestingly, it's ideologically or politically, it's the same process, but kind of approaching it from a different perspective, right? Because
Right, right,
citizen
right,
diplomacy you're describing was people who were upset that we were in such contention and conflict with the Soviet Union, danger of nuclear war, and so on, and they were trying
right.
to build the links to lower the tensions and to, maybe make us nicer to the Soviets so they'd be nicer to us. And this other strand that I was describing was very anti-Soviet.
Yeah, it was
And
oppositional in much ways.
it was oppositional, exactly.
Yeah,
But you're
yeah,
right, but the process was very similar in terms of the links that were made, and then it leading in the '90s to a relationship with these
right,
labor unions.
right, right.
So I mentioned Ludmila Alexeyeva in part because she was so prominent in all of this, and also I grew very fond of her, and we spent a lot of time together. We would travel around Russia together on planes, and then go to different mining towns and so on. And I just had enormous respect for her. She was actually the one who they asked her to test my Russian before they hired me.
Ah,
I had to
yes,
like pass a test with Luda before
right,
before
right.
they would hire me. But anyway, so but what happened was the leaders of these coal miner unions became they also were fond of Luda, and then they through her we expanded our contacts. And one of the early um, important moments I think was in the summer of 1991 when and this was just a few months after I had started working for Fatui. There was a big conference in Moscow, human rights conference. It was called the Andrei Sakharov Memorial Congress because Sakharov had just died the previous year, I think, the late 90. I can't remember exactly, but within a few months of this conference, they had this big event. And it wasn't just human rights groups that were there, it was worker organizations, including the coal miners' unions. And Lane Kirkland, who was then the president of the
Oh,
AFL-CIO, went to the conference, and I was part of his delegation. It was a pretty large delegation, and he met with Boris Yeltsin, um, and I got to sit in on the meeting. It was kind of interesting to watch. And of course, this was Yeltsin in fine form. He was still functioning really well and was smart and energetic and charismatic. But Lane Kirkland, was one of these standard bearers of the old AFL-CIO anti-communism and pro-human rights legacy. But Kirkland also met with the leaders of the coal miners unions, and at the time, so the hotbed of activity was in Siberia, in Western Siberia, the what's called the Kuzbas, which is the Kuznetsk Basin. It's the region is called Kemerovo Oblast, and the big city is Novokuznetsk. And following this conference, I was part of a smaller group that actually went out to Novokuznetsk to visit the miners there. And then later that year, um, I organized a big delegation and this was kind of a interesting structure. It was tripartite. So we had representatives of American labor union. So the United Mine Workers Union sent their secretary treasurer, a senior official, and then maybe it was a couple other people from the AFL-CIO who were there. We had
And the mine workers weren't part of the AFL-CIO at that point, or were they? Had they rejoined or not?
I think they had rejoined. I think they were part at that point. You're
Oh, okay.
right. They sort
Okay.
of went in and out at
Yeah.
different stages, and I think they were part of it then. Um, and actually, by the way, I just remembered I had forgotten this. The guy who went on the trip who was Secretary Treasurer was a guy named Richard Trumka,
Wow, who became
who
president?
later became president, and then I think he might have even been AFL-CIO president for a little while later. I can't
Might
remember,
have been.
but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he was
Yeah.
but so there was Trumka, and then there were some others. Then we had management. So there were representatives of I think it was called the Bituminous Coal Operators Association,
Wow.
BCOA, who was there, so representing the industry. And then we had government. We had not only we had people from the Department of Labor, and particularly there's this thing I assume still exists called the Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA, in our
Yeah. Yeah.
labor.
Uh-huh.
So there was an MSHA person there, and also from the government, we had people from the State Department, from the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau at State, or what we call DRL, were part of it too. And we were supported by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, were supported the trip in some ways, and might have even sent someone along. I can't remember. So it was this, but the idea was we're like, it's a model. We're presenting a model of how our system can work when it's working well. Of course, it doesn't always work that way. It was often
Right.
in conflict of, labor management and government cooperating to create better working conditions, increase safety, and also, by the way, increase productivity and
Uh-huh.
efficiency of the operation, which is good for the business.
Right. So
So
you
so
you
and we
went from Moscow to
Yeah,
Kemerovo?
to
Yeah.
Kemerova, and we spent, I don't remember how, like maybe 4 days in Kemerova, meeting with a lot of people in the coal mine industry. So their equivalents, like local officials,
Right. Yeah.
mine owners, and the workers. We toured the mines. We actually went down into some coal mines, and by the way, so that this trip was quite an undertaking, because on the same trip we also went to Donbass in Ukraine,
Wow.
did the same thing there. We
Yeah.
also had meetings, and I have to be honest, my memories of the Donbass trip are even sharper, because the mines there were in such incredibly bad condition and were so tiny. We were literally crawling on our hands and knees to get into the coal seams where the miners were working, because they're such shallow seams or whatever in these old mines in Donbass. I imagine a lot of the coal mines we visited were probably long closed now, but this was 35 years ago. But
Right.
and I still have a piece of Donbass coal that I brought back with me that I saved as a
Wow.
souvenir. Um, but what was interesting was that they seemed to be very receptive to this idea of management, labor, and government working together in some way. But also, this was not long after all these strikes had happened, so there still was this streak of militancy, and it was clear that the relationships were still sorting themselves out. They were understandably confused about what kind of system they were going to have, who was going to own what. There was a certain amount of just, I don't know, ambiguity and even chaos around the system, which is, again, you would expect that to be happening in this very
Right. This
tight
is
Soviet.
still why the Soviet Union was in existence.
Yes. So
Right.
this is
The last
spring, summer
days of
1991. Yeah.
yeah, last days of the Soviet system.
Yeah, exactly. Um,
Yeah.
so that first trip sort of set the parameters for a lot of our interactions with the miners. But then as time went on, we
And let me stop you for a second. So when you say the miners, was there was a traditional trade union, miners trade union leadership, and there must have been different people who were leading these insurgent miners.
yeah.
So who did you meet with? Did you meet with everybody or only the insurgents, or how did
Yeah.
you do
So
that?
we met with the insurgents, who by then had formed an organization they called the Независимый профсоюз Горняков, the Independent Trade Union of Miners, NPG, we called it. And initially, it was an all Soviet labor union, right? And so the Donbass miners were allied with the miners in Kuzbas, who were also, and they were also allied with miners. And I won't go into detail about this part because I know your focus is Russia, but I'll
Yeah.
just say that there were also miners in Kazakhstan. So we had the
Uh-huh.
Karaganda region of Kazakhstan, coal mining region. There was a NPG in Karaganda also, and later we visited that as well.
Uh-huh.
But so they had an organization, and when we would go to the different regions, and sometimes even when we would go to individual mines, sometimes the official union was always also represented there. Because
Uh-huh.
by this point, I think in the mining sector, the official unions recognized that all the dynamism and energy was in with the independent miner because they were the ones who started the strikes, right? And that was the big deal for everyone was these strikes and what had resulted from them. So in some places the official miners are kind of glommed onto it. You know, they said
Uh-huh.
we're going to jump on the bandwagon, right, and change our rhetoric and change our approach. And in some cases, they had been welcomed to do that. So we did meet with some of those official miner officials were there in some meetings. In other places, they were not. It varied depending on the local relationships. Um,
Right.
and speaking of local relationships, the other thing I remember that was quite interesting was that these miners had become real like local players, you know, because they had been recognized as having this significant role and especially recognized by Boris Yeltsin himself, right, as their, staunch supporters. So they were starting to build their networks out locally. And I remember one case in Kuzbas and I don't, this may not have been for that initial trip with the big delegation. I think because I went out there a number of times later. So I think on one of those later trips, they they said we want to show you something that we think has potential, economic potential for our region. It's not having doesn't have anything to do with mining per se. And they took us on. We went on a Soviet military helicopter, which was looked like it had been well used. Maybe it was used in Afghanistan for all I know. I don't know, but it was not in great shape and you sort of took your life into your hands in these situations. So they put us on this helicopter and they rode us. They flew us out to the middle of nowhere. It was the taiga, that area.
Right.
It's like kind of
Right.
swampy and it thaws in the summer, but it's frozen most of the year. And and in the middle of the taiga, they landed this helicopter and they said, "This is the site of a future resort for tourists. Like we're going to develop this into a wonderful, isn't it beautiful? Lovely nature. There's wildlife. It's fresh air. People are going to love it." And we're looking around saying, "How do you get here other than by
Right.
helicopter, first of
Right.
all? And are people really going to want to come?" But it turned out that they had, formed an alliance with some local group of businessmen, businessmieni, like entrepreneurs who wanted to
Right.
start a tourism business. And they thought, okay, this could be good for us because, if the independent labor union actually become partners, then we'll have some income too. So that's the way people
Uh-huh.
were thinking then. They were always looking
Right.
for an angle, right? And how we
Uh-huh.
can
Uh-huh.
make some extra money. So that was just there were a number of incidents like that, but that one really sticks in my mind, probably because of the
So you,
helicopter.
you formed these relationships where you were in regular contact with the leaders of these organizations,
Yes, yeah,
and you were. How did you? I mean, I assume this was. My God, in those days it was by fax or telex. I mean, it's difficult to stay in very much contact. But so what, you held events or training sessions with them on site in
yeah.
Russia?
So initially, in these first trips, it was almost like ad hoc training going on because we would bring people with us, like that for delegation I was talking about, where we had mine safety and health expert, we had a union expert, we had, I think we on one of these trips, maybe that first one that I mentioned, we even had uh, a guy named Bill. I remember this guy because he was quite a character. His name was Bill Ussery And Bill Ussery was a famous labor mediator. Like he was someone
Yeah, yeah. Very famous guy.
yeah.
Yeah,
You call him in, when the railroad workers were on strike in the US and somebody needed to help
right.
mediate the conflict somehow. And he, he was well up in his, career and his years by this point, but he thought it was like a great adventure to go out to, to the Soviet Union, to Russia to do this. So he was part of that trip. And then he did like almost a seminar on how I approach mediating conflict and what's necessary in terms of the I don't know the attitude of the parties and where they're coming from. So yeah, so early on it was sort of this ad hoc approach, and it wasn't until a little bit later, probably by the end of '91 into '92, where we kind of institutionalized it more. So the first thing we did was we actually opened a field office in Moscow. And by the way, we also had field offices in Kiev, in Almaty, and in Warsaw. Uh,
Mm,
the Warsaw office was covering Belarus and Lithuania,
uh-huh.
building ties with unions in those countries. But the Moscow office, obviously responsible for Russia, that one, and the office was staffed. We had a local staff of Russians who would help with like interpreting and translating documents and also just maintaining the contacts that we needed to have to organize things. One of our key early hires was a woman named Irene Stevenson, um, who at the time, she really interesting person. She had been in her younger days, I think she was a fashion model, but she also, I think she went to Princeton or something, and she was Russian studies and got just totally fascinated by Russia and the Soviet Union. Ended up moving to Moscow. I guess probably it would have been in the 80s, and she actually worked for Itar TASS for a while,
Wow.
doing translation or something. And then she got a job in like 89 or 90 with Baker McKenzie, the U.S. law
Oh,
firm, which had opened
sure.
a Moscow office, and she was a paralegal, and that's where we found her. I don't even remember the circumstances how we discovered her, and we ended up hiring her to help open our field office in Moscow, and she stayed for a long time. She was like sort of the deputy director of the office, but she was the one who knew how to deal with Russians and how
Uh-huh.
to get things done in Russia because she had a lot of experience and she just had that kind of personality, just
Right,
really
right,
dynamic personality.
right, right.
And then the director of the office was, and this was the model that was supposed to be followed in each of our field offices. You would have an American labor organizer or labor expert to be the director. And our first director was a guy named Tom Bradley, and I don't recall anymore what union he came out of in the United States, but I know he was an experienced labor organizer.
Uh-huh.
Didn't have a clue about Russia, didn't speak Russian, didn't hadn't studied anything about the region, so he had a lot to learn. Um, to be honest, I'm not sure that he was as effective as he might have been. Probably because of that, he relied on Irene Stevenson a lot,
Right.
which was fine. But and so anyway, going back to your question, by the time we had our field office set up and we had it staffed, we were also starting to get the grants that we had, and the money was flowing from the National Endowment for Democracy initially, and then later USAID. And then we were able to organize more structured trainings, seminars, bringing experts in, and even sometimes bringing union leaders to the United States for exchange visits. So all
Right.
of that really started kicking in probably more in like 92 is when that all got going more dynamically. And uh, and so and some of and then just going back again to the question of like how we got to make the contacts and to meet people, it started with the miners, and then the coal miners introduced us to a lot of other labor activists and people in different sectors who were trying to do the same thing they had done. That is, form independent labor unions, new organizations that were not part of the old communist trade union structure, and learn how do you get members. And the miners had started really because of in this very kind of conflictual situation, this fraught situation, and with strikes. And it was the strikes that attracted members to them, like because they were speaking out for the things that people wanted to make noise about.
Right.
But for these other unions, and they started emerging in places like maybe some unlikely places. So one of the early ones were the air traffic controllers. Uh,
Huh.
the Russian air traffic control. Actually, it wasn't just Russian initially, but then there was a
Yeah.
Russian branch of it. Air traffic controllers were very mobilized, I would say, and organized early on. And I think they had a couple of strikes at some point. But the thing was you can't just organize by striking, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not. First of all, the strike isn't always even the best tactic to use. Sometimes and particularly if you're a public employee like an air traffic controller, it's difficult. We saw what happened with our air traffic controllers
Right.
when Reagan
Right. Right.
fired all of them
Right.
in 1981 or whatever, and that got rid of the union that existed at the time. Um, but so it was air traffic controllers, teachers. It was interesting. We started getting some teachers unions emerging, and we got introduced to them. Textile workers were among the early ones. Some steel workers, I think, in some of the steel plants also were organizing. But early on, we confronted this question, which you asked about before, about who we were meeting with. Like, was it just
Right.
the independent unions or the official unions? Which was that the independent unions were still small, relatively, and not in much of the economy. They were just in a couple of key sectors. And so the question
Right.
is, if this is going to expand into something bigger in terms of our efforts, our programs, do we need to look beyond just this, the purity of independent unions, right?
Right.
And to be honest, in the time I was with Fatui for 6 years, we never really resolved that question very well.
Huh.
There were
Yeah.
internal debates, and I would say we tried to stay pure as much as possible for the entire time I was there. There were some tentative efforts and some actual, invitations given to people from other unions that were part of the old structure or
Right.
from the old structure. And this was, we only did it when there was kind of an endorsement by one of the independent unions
Uh-huh.
where they
Uh-huh.
would say, yeah, we work with these guys. We know these guys. We trust them. Okay, yeah, they're part of the old structure, but they really do care about their members. They
Uh-huh.
are advocating for worker
Right.
benefits and
Right.
health and
Right.
safety, all those things. And so in those cases, we invited, they would be invited to events
And
and so on.
and and these new nascent independents were scattered all over the country, I assume, and but probably not primarily in Moscow or St. Petersburg. They were in the regions.
That's true. Primarily in the regions. I mean, I think some of them had a Moscow-based representative or structure. I think the air traffic controllers were definitely had a Moscow base. I remember
Yeah.
that. Um, but a lot of them were enterprise based, right? They were based
Yeah.
at a specific, usually state-owned enterprise because there wasn't, privatization hadn't gone so far at that point. And that's a whole other subject that we could get into about what was happening with privatization, how that was affecting all of this. But the point is that yes, I would say it was heavily in the regions and not as
Yeah.
much in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
And was it centered around personalities in those that some leading personality sort of took the lead and formed one of these groups?
Yes, it was, and actually, and that was part of the weakness, frankly, early on, was that a lot of it was personality based. You had these charismatic people, mostly men. I was going to say guys, but there were a few women, especially in the textile industry. I remember there were some female leaders, but mostly men, charismatic men who, had captured the imagination of their fellow workers and were able to kind of build a movement based on that alone. And as things became more standardized or bureaucratized, and some of these people moved on and went on to other roles, it affected the dynamism of the movement. I'll give you one example that I remember. there were two guys who were among the leaders of the Kuzbas coal miners, who when they starting from 1989 when they went on strike. One guy was Anatoly Malikhin, and I remember Anatoly because Tolia, as we called him, because he was like the prototype of a Soviet worker, right? He was like, big and looked strong and kind of rough and not very. He didn't look like an intellectual. Let's put it that way, like a Moscow
Yeah.
intellectual, right?
Right.
And he also, I think he was bald or almost bald, and so he had like this, shiny bald head, and he looked like a guy who would be in mixed martial arts or something like that.
Right. Right.
Anyway, but he was super smart and really, had an instinct for rhetoric and for firing people up and all that stuff. So he was one of the leaders of the strikes, and at the time of the attempted coup in August of 1991, he was kind of like part of, I guess you would say, the Yeltsin shock troops who were out there supporting Boris Yeltsin as he was standing down, the tanks. And I remember being in Moscow not too long after the August coup attempt, and probably in that fall, and Russian television was still covering the aftermath of that was happening, and Malikhin had become like a TV personality because he was so like dramatically outspoken. And I remember what the image that sticks in my mind is him on the day of the coup, or the period when the tanks were in Moscow, and he's out on the street with a gun, like he actually had an automatic weapon. It may not have even been loaded, I don't know, but
Yeah.
he was the epitome of the militant workers. Well, when it came to standardizing the work of the NPG, the Independent Miners Union, and turning it into an effective long-term organization, Malikhin turned out to be kind of a disaster, right? I mean, he wasn't good at that kind of,
Uh-huh.
and so I don't remember exactly where he ended up or what happened to him, but he kind of faded away pretty quickly because he was part of that early phase. Another guy who was among the Kuzbas miners named Mikhail Kisluk, and I remember Kisluk because he had a very different personality than Malik, and much more reserved and kind of soft spoken, but very articulate. And he was typical of a number of these minor leaders in that he had higher education. Like I don't remember if he had a degree in physics or something. He had gone to
Huh.
a very good university. Maybe he would studied in Moscow. I don't remember. And it was interesting. Like in the late Soviet period, I think coal miners were being paid a lot better than people in other professions, which I guess made sense because it was dangerous work and they should be. But even before the independent miners emerged, it was people were attracted to go work there because the pay was better. So even very highly educated people who could have, I don't know, been academics or something like that, ended up in the coal miners union. And Kisluk was one of these people. And then what happened was after the coup in '91, and after he and Malikhin and the others had proven themselves to be loyal to Yeltsin, he got appointed by Yeltsin as the governor of Kemerovo Oblast. And he
Wow.
served, I had forgotten this. I looked it up when I was going over my notes here. He served as governor of Kemerovo from 91 to 97, so for a good long time. And I don't remember thinking when I met Kisluk, like, oh, this guy is, like political leader material or something like that. But he was clearly going somewhere. He was going
Yeah.
places. And so these are kind of extreme examples, but not untypical of what happened to some of these early union leaders, is that they had talents which made them
Right.
effective in that situation, and then they left the labor movement and went into other things because they were able to, use those talents. The
Right.
talents were recognized.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
so anyway, so that
Yeah, that's interesting. So you were trying to help these guys institutionalize their new, emerging unions, right? Turn them into long-term institutions. Um,
yes.
yeah. And how would you evaluate the success of that?
Good question. One I've thought a lot about over the years. Well, first of all, I have to stipulate that I had once I left Fatui in 1997 and joined the State Department. I didn't pay nearly as close attention to developments in the labor movement. So I don't really have a granular sense of how these organizations fared. But from the little bit that I followed, I think by and large, they failed to develop into a sustainable organizations and growing ones that expanded their membership and became not only a factor as worker representatives and in the economy, but as a political factor in the way that, for example, the American labor movement used to be in our country. I'm not sure how much it is today, but
Right.
politically significant. And it failed in Russia, and um, and I think, well, there's a lot we can get into some of the reasons that may be the case, but I think that there was this period in the early 90s when they were kind of on the upswing, and because of that, and especially the most visible groups like the coal miners and the air traffic controllers, other workers started to get interested, but at the same time, and forming their own independent unions. But at the same time, you had a lot of countervailing pressures. For example, privatization, which completely
Yeah.
scrambled the relationships, often reduced the size of the workforce by a lot. You also had, and I don't have a granular sense or memory of this, but there was, adoption of new legislation in the Russian Federation regarding labor relations, and I think some of that was not very favorable to union organizing, kind of like we have in the United States, and so that made it even more difficult for them. But at bottom, kind of bottom line here is that I think there was an idea that the AFL-CIO had, that Fatui had, about the role that independent unions could play in a transitioning Russia that was moving to a more market-oriented economy and to more democracy, right, a democratic system that turned out to be very unrealistic. So I do think they were deeply affected. I know this from being inside the organization by the example of Solidarność in Poland
Right.
and the
Right.
support that had happened in the 80s, and then the role that the historical role that Solidarność played in bringing about change in Poland and arguably change in the whole communist bloc, right? That
Right.
showed that
Right.
things could be different, and it was Lech Wałęsa and other leaders of Solidarity, and it was the alliance that they made with other um, forces in Polish society, the Catholic Church, civil society groups, which made them so significant, right?
Right.
So in the minds of the leadership of my organization at the time, like, where is the Russian Solidarność gonna come from?
Uh-huh.
It's gonna come from
Right.
somewhere. Maybe it's the coal miners who are the center of it.
Right.
And who is the Russian Lech Wałęsa going to be, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they were totally deluded and thought like this is going to happen overnight or that it's going to be easy, but I do believe that they really thought this was going to germinate into something much bigger,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
grow,
Right.
and become politically significant too, and be related to the transition that at the time we
Right.
all thought was going to go in the direction of democracy and marketing.
Right. Right. Well, so you were and I'm focused on this period a lot because you have a unique perspective on it, um, that's different than many other people I've interviewed. So I'm lingering on it because I'm really interested in how
Sure.
you see it. And so you're involved with people in the workforce at a time where huge numbers of people weren't being paid. They weren't being paid at all. They were showing up to work uh, and not being paid. And how did this impact this notion of a labor movement? Well, if you have people working and not being paid, And that is, and then privatization on top of it. Uh, it had to be enormously complex in order to figure out what position for labor unions to take vis-a-vis these external conditions. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you're
Yeah,
100% correct. And it turns out that this became a major obsession of mine in my later years at Fatui. Um, because, I mean, just to kind of give the context here, as
yeah,
we developed these field offices and got the grants flowing, and I should say that, it wasn't hard to get funding in the early 90s from the US government for anything that was related to democracy building. There was a lot of money flowing. The budgets were huge at that time. And so our grant proposals in the early years, like you could like write it on the back of a napkin and get a couple $1 million. I'm exaggerating, but only
right,
slightly. Later, the requirements for these proposals got much more rigorous, and you had to the budgets were very detailed, et cetera. But anyway, we were able to get the funding without much trouble. So we had the funding, we had the field offices, we had programs in place, and what that meant for me in my job was that I had time and a more kind of, well, my responsibility for kind of running programs became much less because we had people doing that in the field. And so I had time to reflect and analyze and look more systematically at what was happening in the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, the former Soviet Union and all the regions we were working in, and particularly in Russia. And at a certain point, and I want to say it was probably like 94, 95, 96. It was my last 3 years at Fatui, where I became really focused on this issue of wage arrears that you were talking about.
right.
Because it was, well, I wasn't the only one looking at it. Of course, people were talking about it a lot. It was obvious that what was happening, but the question was, why was it happening? What were the causes of it? And then how were employees reacting and what were they going to do about it? And and I ended up writing some articles about it, and I even like appeared on some radio show that the Kennan Institute in Washington ran at the time to talk about wage arrears. Um, and it was so I guess I'll say two things about it. One, kind of what my conclusions were, and two, um, what it meant for the labor movement and the unions in Russia. Um, so in terms of the issue, uh, there was clearly a lot going on that, and by the way, the article I wrote that I was proudest of um, was in a journal called Demokratizatsiya, which was a journal, and there was this woman who I still run into sometimes in Washington named Louise Shelley. And Louise is an expert. She used to be affiliated with George Mason University, and I think maybe she still is. But she's an expert on corruption in the post-Soviet world, and it's particularly in Russia. And for years, she did stuff for the Department of Justice, had programs focused on anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and she was involved in those. But she's also studied it, and she was one of the editors of Demokratizatsiya, and she was the one who got my article in there. But anyway, and it was the title of it was "They Pretend to Pay Us," which is from there was this old Soviet expression: "They pretend to
Right.
pay us, and we pretend to work."
And work. Yes.
And what that was what was happening, of course, in this period was that they were pretending to pay and they weren't paying for months at a time, and sometimes when workers did get paid in quotation marks, they were paid in kind. If it was a sausage factory, they would get sausage. I remember there was a great picture that I think was included in the article that I eventually got published. It was workers from a tire factory somewhere in not in Moscow. I can't remember, somewhere in one of the Russian regions, and
Yaroslavl, maybe?
maybe Yaroslavl. That, yes, that could
Yeah.
have been it. And the photo was of workers coming home rolling the tires that they had been paid as their wages, like they were given tires for their.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so that stuff was happening all over the place, and it was clear that the whole system of had broken down in terms of the way money flowed in the economy, the way enterprises were managed, and the way enterprise managers did their payroll, right? And there were issues of debt. There was a kind of debt overhang in the entire economy at the time, and you know enterprises were hugely in debt to the utility companies. They hadn't paid their electricity bills for months and months and months. And then the utility companies in turn went into debt and couldn't pay the banks that they might have, the Russian banks that they might have borrowed money from. And it was a cascading effect that went through the whole system. But obviously the workers were kind of at the got the brunt of the
Mhm.
effect because they literally
Right.
weren't bringing home a paycheck that they could spend for food for their families. So the effect this was having on the unions was it was making it very difficult for them to talk about the set of issues where they could actually do something for their members, right? So as they're trying to recruit and they're saying, well, if you join our union, we'll bargain with and we'll put pressure on, and even with the threat of strikes, management to get you higher wages and better working conditions and better benefits and so on and so forth. Um, and the potential members are basically saying, first, we need to get paid. Like, we're not even being paid anything. So, what's the point? People were just much less focused on this whole suite of issues because there was something so basic that wasn't happening. And the unions, these independent unions, weren't offering solutions. They had no answer to how to get the wage arrears cleared up, right? Because it
Yeah.
was so
Yeah.
complicated. Nobody had answers at the time. It was like it seemed to be beyond the control of any single actor in the system. So it really complicated their organizing efforts. And I think that the communist unions, who were sort of their competitors in a sense, at least could often say, well, we are the ones who we're part of, we're in the system. Like we have our friends who work at the local bank or our friends who work in the local oblast administration or whatever. And so we'll sooner or later we'll fix this, but you need to rely on us and our trusted contacts.
Right.
It's not about militancy or strikes or pressure. It's about like knowing the right people who will
How
get
the,
you the
yeah.
tires instead of the
Right.
sausage, instead of the
Right.
paycheck. And that's the way, of course, that's the way traditionally the whole system worked in the Soviet period. That there was that old expression "blot," right? Like the blot
Right.
was about your connections and your ability to get stuff, and that carried over into this post-Soviet period where you know the normal mechanisms of the market economy were completely not functioning, and so again, it boiled down to who you knew and who you could
Yeah.
trust. And
Right.
communist unions were at some level trusted because they were familiar, right?
Right.
So I think it was that whole thing was pretty devastating. I think also for the independent.
Right. And in terms of privatization, so this was still people got privatization vouchers. Did they feel positive about privatization? Were they in support of it? Were you in support of it? I mean, what position did you take as an organization towards privatization?
Yeah, no, another good fundamental question that we grappled with a lot in those years. I think that the basic model that the AFL-CIO and Fatui were putting out there was what should labor's role be in a market economy? Like our starting assumption was it's going to eventually be something more like the United States or Europe, and workers need to be prepared for that and to play a role, have some power that could protect their interests. So there was an assumption that there was going to be privatization because if you're going to get to that point, there it has to happen. And the question was how to do it in a way that didn't hurt people too badly and that also ended up resulting in viable economic units that would, produce profits and lead to more prosperity for everyone, including the workers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that was the underlying assumption of how it was going to work. But I do remember our organization was critical of the way that privatization was being handled and being um, advised by Western advisors. I mean, I'm sure other people in your archive have talked about the whole that what was it called, the Harvard Institute for International Development, HID
Right. 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 Right.
scandal around that, and generally the USAID and Western support for privatization, the voucher scheme, and all that. The AFL-CIO, it wasn't like we weren't super outspoken. We weren't like issuing statements about this all the time, but behind the scenes and sometimes publicly, we were saying we don't think this is being done in a way that adequately protects worker rights, and there's no real worker voice in the way it's being conceived and carried out either. And and again, going back to models that we were talking about earlier, I think there was I remember we published some things, some articles, and talked up the idea of look at Poland. Like Poland is maybe a better model. Now Poland is later was famous for Jeffrey Sachs shock therapy and all that stuff initially, but arguably the way they handled privatization was a little more was more effective than the way it was done in Russia, and led to less um, out and out, theft and corruption and oligarchy emerging. But now, of course, the conditions in Poland were very different because you had, first of all, Solidarność was already well established, had really good had power in the system. Secondly, Poland was had a lot of private sector already, even before the fall of the communist government, because they had been
Right.
experimenting for years, especially in agriculture, but also in terms of small business and so on. They already had, so they weren't starting from scratch. And so there were a lot of things that were different. But as the AFL-CIO was touting that as a model, and again, it always came back to like the way things happen there is the way they should happen in Russia, with a strong labor component, worker component. And so that was, to the extent that we were advocating anything, it was essentially the Polish model.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, and we were critical, and some of the things that I was writing about wage arrears and all that, there was an implicit undertone which was saying that we're not helping. The US is, in what we're doing through our USAID project and stuff, is not helping this situation, and we need to take a fresh look at how supporting privatization.
Oh, okay. So you are on the one hand relying on the USAID, but another being kind of the loyal opposition in a way, to say,
Yeah,
maybe what you're doing, your policies aren't helping the situation on the ground. Um,
yeah, exactly.
yeah. Okay. So I want to ask you two more questions, and then I want us to schedule a second interview because
Good,
we have a
good.
lot more to cover.
Yes.
So 1993, Boris Yeltsin, in his assault on the White House in the Soviet Parliament, used undemocratic means in the attempt or stated goal of creating a democratic society. And what position did you take, or were you about that assault on the Soviet Parliament?
Yeah, great question. I was just looking at my notes, and I had something in there to talk about 1993 and the conflict with the Duma and
Okay,
so on.
right.
So I'm glad you brought it up. Um, so, I mean, first, just to answer your question directly, the AFL-CIO and Fatui um, were, I would say, if not all in, at least sympathetically inclined towards Yeltsin from the get-go. And of course that had something to do with, the emergence of independent Russia and the role that the coal miners played and the coal miners alliance with Yeltsin. So we were
Yeah.
predisposed to think that Yeltsin was probably, even if some of his methods were undemocratic or unfortunate that in the long run it was better for reform and democracy in Russia if Yeltsin was in charge, and that and of course this was partly his what Yeltsin endeavored to do at that time, which was to paint the Duma opposition as being reactionaries and being very much like the coup plotters from August 1991,
Right.
that ilk,
Right.
right? And I don't know. And again, I haven't studied this deeply, so I don't know if there was some truth to that or not. I don't remember enough about the circumstances. But the point is that to some extent, I think we bought into that.
Hmm.
So now no one was necessarily looking to the AFL-CIO per se as like, asking us for like, what's your position on this? But in
Right.
practice and in terms of our actions, we were again in this camp that, well, we got to keep riding the Yeltsin train because that's the best hope for reform in Russia in the long run.
Hmm.
And part of the way this manifested itself was that when Yeltsin called the constitutional referendum in December of 93 to, basically change the constitution to give more power to the presidency and which I guess is still the same, it's more or less the same constitution today.
Yeah, it's been amended, but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And that referendum, we were part of a consortium of international organizations, many American organizations that were already working in Russia, that volunteered to be observers for the referendum, to go out and around the country and observe the voting process. And I remember this very well because I had a kind of a colorful experience around that referendum. So I went with my friend and colleague Irene Stevenson, this woman I was talking about earlier, who was a great travel companion, especially because she like her Russian was so damn good. It was amazing. She was like completely fluent. And she also, it wasn't just language, she kind of knew she fluently spoke Russian culture and society too.
Yeah.
So she was a excellent person to accompany me. And the two of us, went to a city called Saransk, which is the capital of the Moldovan Republic or Mordovia,
Okay.
and which is one of these, titular ethnic republics. And at the time in the 90s, of course, Yeltsin was encouraging, at least rhetorically, he was encouraging the republics to the constituent regions of Russia to take more power to themselves and to experiment and do things, locally, because it's like this decentralization model, which of course then Putin completely reversed 10 years later. But the point is that at the time, Mordovia was being touted, and by the way, there's like less than 10% of the inhabitants of Mordovia at that time. I assume it's similar today. Actually, are ethnically Mordovian.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Mordovians are. It's actually I think it's a Turkic people originally who speak a Finno-Ugric language, but everyone there speaks Russian, and it's not. The Mordovians don't have much of a presence. Anyway, so we went to Saransk and we observed the referendum, and there wasn't really much to see. It was people dutifully went out and voted, and overwhelmingly in favor of the constitutional referendum because the president had said they should. And the voting procedures seemed to be, I mean, we didn't find any glaring violations. But what was more interesting was that while we were there was a kind of parallel conflict between the president of Mordovia, who had been appointed by Yeltsin in 1991, and the parliament of the Moldovan Republic, the local parliament. And it was a very similar tension where, like, the president was this reformer type who had come in wanting to, upend everything and make it more democratic. And interestingly, his background was he was some like kind of obscure mid-level bureaucrat who had protested some corruption scandal in the late 80s and essentially become like a human rights activist and very outspoken and led a public movement to root out corruption in Mordovia. And then he got appointed by Yeltsin to be not just the governor, but the president of the Moldovan Republic, which they called it then.
Right.
And but then the parliament was pushing back, and this guy was clearly kind of he was a bit naive and not very politically astute, which you would expect from, a kind of idealistic human rights activist, right?
Right. Right.
He was losing in the conflict at the time, and Irene and I actually got a meeting with him. Um, because we were the only international observers in Saransk, I think. So we were a big deal, right? We were these
Right.
Americans who had come there. So we had a meeting with the president, and first of all, the parliament at the time, I mean the presidential building was surrounded by protesters or demonstrators who I guess were supporting the parliament in the conflict, and they were holding up signs. So we go through this cordon, and we get led up to the office, and the president's all by himself. He had no aides, no staff or anything. It's just us and the president. And there didn't seem to be many people around in general. I think he was like they were deserting him basically,
Ah,
being left alone. So we have this conversation, and he's giving us his perspective, and like we're I'm fighting for democracy in Mordovia, and we need support from outside, and President Yeltsin is supporting me, but he's distracted by other things, obviously. So anyway, so we leave um, Saransk, and at the airport, as we're flying out, we're checking in for our flight, and the woman who was, and the rules were kind of loose in those days too. About there was the security was almost nothing.
right.
The whole system was, as reflecting larger trends, was very chaotic. So the woman who was checking me in, first of all, she didn't speak English at all. So I hand her my American passport, which she couldn't read and she couldn't understand anything in it. And she didn't even know she had to it was like a handwritten ticket, that it was a physical ticket, and she was writing it down. And she was clearly searching for my name. And what I
Right.
didn't really notice at the time was that in my passport, I had stuck the business card of the president of Mordovia. Vasily Guslianikov was his name.
Right. Right.
So his card was in, and it must have fallen out when she opened my passport. And so she wrote on the ticket Vasily Guslianikov. So that was my name for
You got
purposes.
on the plane
And I
with
got on the
that name.
plane. Of course, nobody stopped me. Like they weren't checking to make sure that the name on the ticket and the
Right.
passport were
Right.
the same. I get on the plane, and I traveled back to Moscow as Vasily Guslianikov, the president of Mordovia, which was like really bizarre, kind of
Right.
real
Right.
experience. But what it revealed, I think, at the time, and also as I reflect on it later, was that this this conflict between the reformers, so called, this new
Right.
generation, and the old guard, the old establishment, was not resolved. It was still very much playing itself out. And
Right.
while Yeltsin won in his conflict with the Duma and stayed in power for another, 7 years or whatever, Guslianikov lost. So
Yeah.
not too long after we left, he got booted out by the Moldovan parliament, and they put in
Uh-huh.
their own person, like the chairman of the Duma of Mordovia became the new leader. I think they abolished the presidency altogether or something like that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so so you could see, these trends playing out, and whatever was happening in Moscow, which is what everyone was paying attention to, the story was not the same in the regions
In the
necessarily.
regions. Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
so anyway, that was
Yeah. So I want my last question before we schedule our next interview is 1996. So I think I know how you turn out on 1996, but the 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin by that time, most people recognized him as kind of falling down drunk. He was sick. He was way behind in the polls. And then elements of the Russian oligarchs rallied behind him, and they had a lot of support from the United States in resuscitating his fortunes, and he won that election, or it's believed he won that election. Let's put it that way. And so, did you have any role in your organization? Have any role in that election with Yeltsin?
uh, not to my recollection, no.
Okay.
I don't think we did. And uh, I will say that the organizations that we were continuing to support at that point, um, through our programs and so on, were almost uniformly still pro Yeltsin, and
Uh-huh.
probably played a role in the campaign and, campaign for him. But we were not directly involved in that. And I suppose, I guess the other way in which were sort of implicated, you might say, was that we were funded by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government, as you said, was squarely, pushing for Yeltsin to win.
Right, right.
And so that we were kind of guilty by association, you might say. But I don't recall any direct role we played, um, because that wasn't our brief, in a sense.
Yeah,
Politics
yeah.
wasn't our brief. It was
Oh,
probably
okay.
different for like NDI and IRI, which both had
Right,
programs in Russia at the time.
right.
So I don't know whether you've talked to anyone from those two organizations yet.
No, I haven't. I
It's
haven't.
archive project, but because I know some of the people who were working in Russia during the 90s, for NDI and I, including, by the way, Mike McFall, who you
Ah,
may know. So McFall, who later became ambassador to Russia under Obama and has been very outspoken and still comes out, is on TV a lot on MSNBC or whatever.
right.
McFall worked for NDI in Russia in the 1990s, but
National Democratic Institute.
National Democratic Institute, which is
Yeah.
one of the four core
Yeah.
grantees of
Ah, okay.
NED, of
Okay.
National Endowment for Democracy.
Okay. So,
Um,
but were you looking at it? I mean, it was part of the environment you were working in. Were you nervous about that election while it was going on? And
yeah,
what it meant, what it would mean for you and your work and the unions?
yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, I do think that we have looking back on it, and maybe not even so many years afterwards, we had a much more nuanced view of what was going on than people did at the time.
Uh-huh.
What I remember, it's hard sometimes to separate out what you think you remember about something versus, the your 2020 hindsight,
Yeah. Right.
years
Right.
later, of what you were really thinking at the time, right? So
Yes.
I admit that my memory might be clouded. And there's some expression that someone said, this famous expression, like I don't remember. It's something like, I remember more than. Anyway, I'll come up with it's a great quote
All
that
right.
of what I just said, that some wise person once said. But anyway, um, the I remember that Yeltsin's main opponent at the time was Zyuganov, I believe, the head of the
Right. Right.
party,
Zyuganov was ahead in the polls at one
and
point.
was ahead
He
in the
was the
polls
head of
among.
the Reformed Communist Party at
Yes.
that point. Yeah.
And I know that because of, again, I was steeped in this idea that, communism was a terrible tragedy for the Russian people, and that, that the worst thing that could happen to Russia would be to go back to the communist system. And so even though it was, as you say, it was portrayed as the Reformed Communist Party, there was an automatic assumption that if Zyuganov wins, it's a disaster
Yeah.
all
Uh-huh.
around.
Right. Right.
Um, and including especially for these independent trade unions that we were supporting, because they had emerged very specifically as a reaction against the communist trade unions, which
Mhm.
presumably were allied with Zyuganov, right? So I think at the basic level, we were rooting for Yeltsin to beat Zyuganov because we thought it would be really bad for everything we did if Zyuganov won. Um, the aspect of the oligarchs and the oligarchs who supported Yeltsin and, kind of enabling all of this. I, that wasn't secret at the time, right? And it was known that what was going on, I think, to a large extent. And I think I remember, let's put it that way, being troubled by that, in the sense of,
Uh-huh.
like, okay, this is not the Boris Yeltsin that I met in 1991 at the Human Rights Conference with Lane Kirkland, right?
Yeah.
The bloom is off the rose a bit here, and there's compromises being made. But to the extent that I sorted it out in my head and decided what I thought about it, or what we as Fatui thought about it, I think it was kind of like, you know, the lesser of two evils
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah.
calculation. Like, okay, he's far from perfect, and he's associating with some bad people, but sometimes that's what politics is, right?
Right.
You make alliances and compromises. So I think
Right.
there was an element of that justification being made. And I don't, and then just reflecting back on our earlier conversation about privatization and so on, and I do, there were lots of troubling things happening in the 90s with respect to the way the economy was developing, the whole privatization process, the way it was done, the emergence of these oligarchs. And I'm sure I know that I was troubled at the time. Like it's not just looking back on it. I was troubled at the
Yeah.
time. But I think it's putting it in the larger context of what we thought was happening and hoped would happen in terms of transition to market-based economy and democracy. There was always this element of like, okay, well, we just got to get past this stage. It's not being done in the best way, and there are compromises being made, including some moral compromises, right? But if it all comes out well in the end, and it moves into and it continues to move in a generally positive direction, it's worth it.
Yeah.
That was kind of like the way I justify. And I don't think I was alone in approaching it that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of where I
Okay. Okay. Good. Well, look, I know at this point, at some point soon in this narrative, you leave for TUI and we go to another stage of your involvement with Russia, which I want to give us a full amount of time to do. So let's
sure.
do that in the second interview, if that works for you.
That's great. Yeah, no, I'm glad it worked out that way because it definitely gave me a chance to fully explore this early period. And now, yeah, I think it's better to do as a separate session for the State Department.